Professor Karagiorgis, dear colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen, and many friends. Welcome to the inaugural event of the 52nd cycle of public lectures, which is organized by the Archaeological Research Unit every semester, practically since the unit's foundation. All of you that have become Monday evening regulars must be wondering why Professor Vasiliki Kassianidou, director of the unit since 2015, is not on the podium tonight. I assure you that I have not deposed her, nor do I have any intention to replace her. After having served as the unit's director for 4 terribly demanding but extremely successful years, Lina has finally asked for and was granted a much-deserved sabbatical. On behalf of all my colleagues in the Department of History and Archaeology, and on behalf of our students, I express our most sincere thanks for her wholehearted devotion to the director's role, for the dozens of projects she has directed, the conferences and workshops she has organized, the collections she has brought into the unit, the successful coaching of many postdoctoral researchers, and for the countless time-consuming administrative duties she had to handle on a daily basis. Please join me in thanking Lina and wishing her a productive, peaceful, and creative research leave. But as you can understand, we are now headless, because the slow-burning, slow-motion university administration was late in publicizing the position. The deadline for the submission of applications has only just expired. And as chair once again of the committee that will elect the new director, I can tell you that we should consider ourselves very happy if we have our director by the end of the year. However, a God-sent volunteer has stepped in, and he has already shouldered with amazing success the researcher's night. Our savior is none other than our colleague Thanasis Vionis, Associate Professor of Byzantine Archaeology and Art, and Thanasis has also rescued the public lecture cycle. Indeed, the program which you have received has been diligently put together by Thanasis, to whom I express my sincere gratitude for his willingness to undertake this demanding responsibility. As I surrender the podium to Thanasis, who will introduce our first speaker, allow me to say how delighted we are to have Mr. Sam Beaver, the High Commissioner of Australia, with us this evening on his very first visit to the unit. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Lina. Your Excellency, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is our pleasure to open the 52nd public lecture series of the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus by welcoming our tonight's distinguished speaker, Dr. Craig Barker from the University of Sydney. Dr. Barker is Manager of Education and Public Programs at Sydney University Museums. He holds a PhD in Classical Archaeology from the University of Sydney and has participated or directed archaeological field projects in Australia, Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. We in Cyprus know him as a director of the Paphos Theatre Archaeological Project, the systematic excavation of the World Heritage listed site at the ancient theatre of Nea Paphos in Cyprus, having succeeded Professor Richard Green. The excavations at the theatre and surrounding environs have been conducted under the auspices of the Department of Antiquities of the Republic of Cyprus since 1995 and have received financial support from the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens. Apart from his interest in ancient theatre architecture, the history and archaeology of ancient Cyprus, Hellenistic and Roman ceramics, transport, amphory and wine trade, museum education and the dispersal of Cypriot antiquities in Australia are also included in his list of primary research interests. Similarly, he has published extensively on the excavations of the Nea Paphos theatre, on Cypriot antiquities in Australia, on history and museum teaching, and on ancient commercial amphory in journals and special edited volumes, while he was also the co-director of the Festschrift in honor of Professor Richard Green. Apart from the Paphos Theatre Archaeological Project, Dr. Barker has been co-curator for the Art and Archaeology exhibition Travellers from Australia, which ran as part of the Paphos 2017 European Capital of Culture Festival program. He has also curated other exhibitions of Cypriot interest in previous years, such as The Sky and the Sea, Ancient Cypriot Art in 2016, and The Aphrodite's Island in 2012, and regularly broadcasts on the Australian radio. Dr. Barker has also received a number of prestigious grants from Australia and is a member of a number of archaeological and teaching associations in Australia and Greece. The title of Dr. Barker's lecture tonight is Theatre Architecture in Cyprus, the Evidence from the Excavations of the Nea Paphos Theatre. As his excavation project nears completion of final publication, Greg Barker will assess the architectural development of the theatre of Paphos and compare it with other Hellenistic and Roman theatres of Cyprus to discern whether any theatrical architectural trends and traditions are apparent on the island. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance. Dr. Barker, the stage is yours.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Can I begin by saying it is a great honour and privilege to be invited to speak to you tonight, and especially a double thrill to be the first speaker in this cycle of talks as well. So thank you for having me. Before I begin talking about the theatre project, I should acknowledge that the work of the Paphos Theatre Archaeological Project based at the University of Sydney is only possible, obviously because of the support of the Department of Antiquities of the Republic of Cyprus, and also because of our support and financial assistance from the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens and the Nicholson Museum at the University of Sydney, which is where I am employed. We also, of course, have many friends and supporters both in Paphos and here in Nicosia, and it's lovely to see some old familiar faces again. I'd also, just in passing, like to acknowledge the fantastic support that the project has had over the years from the Australian High Commission in Nicosia, so thank you very much. And also to acknowledge back home the wonderful, wonderful assistance provided by the Cyprus High Commission in Canberra, the capital of Australia. We are currently in the process of conducting our 19th season of excavations in 24 years, plus a number of study seasons. There are currently 68 Australians in Paphos. I would advise you not to go near Paphos in the next 4 weeks if you want a quiet time. But I just want to mention in passing that we are having a site open day and a site party on Saturday the 19th of October. And if anyone is in Paphos or near Paphos on that weekend, we would love to have you come and visit and to see the work that we are doing. The project was inaugurated by Professor Richard Green, who you'll see in the photograph here, along with my colleague Dr. Smadar Gabrielli. Richard Green does send his greetings to those of you who know him as well, and is very keenly following our work from Adelaide in Australia, where he now lives in as close to retirement as archaeologists get, which is not at all. But what I'd like to do this evening is to discuss the processes of, or rather the findings from those 19 seasons of excavation in terms of the theatre architecture, and in terms of the questions that I and my colleagues are increasingly beginning to ask in terms of the role of theatre within urbanisation in Cyprus, and the relationship between the theatre and the Hellenistic and Roman urban landscape of a centre such as Nea Paphos as well. And then if I have time at the end, what I'd like to do is to discuss the theatre of Paphos in relationship to other Roman theatres on the island, and to see if we can begin to see some degree of patterns in terms of chronology and in terms of the way it was being used. One of the other exciting aspects of the excavations of this project is that it has been a training excavation for generations of primarily Sydney-based but Australian archaeologists, and we're very proud to continue a long tradition of Australians working on the island right back to James Stewart, but of course perhaps best typified by Jenny and the ongoing interest in Bronze Age Cyprus as well, that many of us and many of our colleagues back in Australia feel as well. The site of the theatre is of course located in the very northeastern corner of the ancient city walls of Paphos, built into the southern slope of a hill known since the Middle Ages as Fabrica. It's positioned in an incredibly important location, as I will discuss later on, that we now realise its close proximity to the northeastern city gate is reflective of a much larger engagement of the theatre with urban infrastructure and urban activity. But it is perhaps really only through drone photography that you get a sense of the size and the scale of the structure as it has been uncovered, and also a sense of how the topography of Fabrica Hill has very much influenced the way that the ancient architects initially constructed the theatre and then modified and adapted it as time went by. It's also, when I see an image like this, that you realise how quickly you forget the sheer amount of soil that is moved from an archaeological site. Although paying for a spoil heap to be removed last week, certainly the budget gets a sense of how much soil has been moved as well. But it's perhaps with photographs like this which demonstrates the site before we began work, a photograph taken by Richard Green when, I believe, Vassos, you were actually showing him around the site at that point in time. And of course, whoops, as it looks now. And of course, by exposing so much of that architecture, it's also given us an opportunity to begin to visualise how that site must have looked. And of course, it's an excellent realisation of the amount of architectural material which has actually been robbed and taken from the site as well. So one of the things that we've been very keen to do with the project is a series of visualisation in digital programs which enable us to let viewers of the site an opportunity to get a sense of how it may have looked in various phases. And I'm going to be talking to you later on, and indeed if anyone's interested after the lecture, to give you an opportunity to actually put on the virtual reality goggles that we have and to enter into a three-dimensional version of the Antonine phase of the theatre. Here is the site from the south of Fabrica Hill, looking up towards the cavea, up towards the seating, and you get a sense of the size and the scale. At its maximum extent, the theatre of Paphos measures just under 90 metres from side to side, and our best estimates are that at its greatest extent, this is under the Antonine emperors in the middle of the 2nd century AD, that this structure would have had a seating capacity for somewhere between 8 and 8,500 audience members. Whoops, there we go. There we go. This orthographic image captured by our project surveyors over 2 of our most recent field seasons is actually more than 6,500 individual images taken from a pole camera stitched together using software. Indeed, it's actually so accurate that you can pick up cigarette butts and very tiny things on the ground if you zoom in very closely on it. But again, by using technology such as this, it's enabling us to visualise the relationship of the theatre with other structures and other infrastructure within the area that we're now calling the theatre quarter of Paphos. It was initially the theatre precinct, but we've made it larger, so it's the theatre quarter of ancient Paphos. And actually, I'll move on. So the theatre quarter. So again, you'll see that within the urban landscape of modern Kato Paphos, just how significant the size and the scale of the structure was. Now, over the 24 years of excavation, what we have been able to ascertain through stratigraphic excavation and analysis of the architecture, and we are in the process of working towards volume 1 of the final excavation report to be published through Sydney University Press We were aiming to do it next year for the 25th anniversary, but it will probably actually be very early 2021. But this work is building upon quite a few papers that we have produced over the years. The first one was a report by Richard Green and our architect Jeff Stennett in RDAC in 2002. A follow-up paper on our understanding of the architecture that Jeff and myself co-wrote in 2004. A paper that the three of us wrote and published following a major international conference on Greek theatre that came out in 2015, and a paper that we have coming out in the last Paphos international conference, which was held in 2017. So a steady body of work analysing and questioning various aspects of the architecture. And we can relatively confidently say that we have at least 6 phases of architectural development within the structure of the building. In some cases, these modifications and adaptations of the architecture have been forced upon Paphos as a result of earthquake. In other cases, they are reflections of contemporary architectural changes and designs. But it's rather interesting, and I've got an image later on which compares the size of our theatre with the Sydney Opera House, an image that Jeff Stennett, our architect, put together for a Sydney audience. But I'm exactly the same age as the Sydney Opera House. My mother has stories of me in a bathtub watching the opening of the Sydney Opera House on television. And the Sydney Opera House is undergoing currently its 4th phase of modification and rebuilding as well. So I've got to say that I'm feeling as old as the Sydney Opera House, but I've not had quite as many facelifts as it has had. But this concept of a structure being used as a venue for performance and for spectacle for 6.5 centuries is an extraordinary run of the lifespan of the city of Nea Paphos. So we are suggesting that the theatre was constructed around about the date of the foundation of Nea Paphos, at the very end of the 4th century, beginning of the 3rd century BC, with the caveat that, of course, we, like everyone else who has excavated in Paphos, are finding incredibly large amounts of pre-foundation material as well, that there was undoubtedly occupation. And we were just talking about this morning, weren't we? Our earliest phase is the one of which we know the least about, for obvious reasons. Most Roman adaptations of earlier theatres largely obliterate the remnants of those earlier phases. But we have what we call the Alexandrian phase of the middle 2nd century BC, right up until an Augustan rebuilding following the earthquake of 15 or 17 BC, depending upon which ancient source you believe. Interestingly, the theatre has no clear evidence of a 1st century AD phase, and there is considerable evidence for a Flavian period earthquake devastating Paphos. I am increasingly of the opinion that we must have had some degree of activity within that phase, even if the site itself was relatively unscathed by any seismic activity. But what is quite fascinating is just how little architectural evidence there is for any type of activity between the period of Augustus and the period of the theatre's greatest expansion under the Antonine emperors in the middle 2nd century AD. Most of my personal recent research has been on the Severan phase, and I won't have time tonight to discuss in any detail, but I am actually suggesting that we have a massive rethink of how Paphos was adapted and changed under the Antonine and the Severan periods. And I think that there is increasing body of evidence to suggest that these were quite significant periods in the town's history. We then have at some point in the 3rd century a phase in which the theatre is converted. We're increasingly arguing that it was converted to an arena under the Severans, under Caracalla in particular, but whether it was actually used as such is difficult to tell. But certainly from the middle of the 3rd century until its final destruction by the devastating earthquakes of the late 4th century, the focus of the theatre moves from the stage building to the former orchestra which could have been flooded and used for displays of aquatic life and for performances of performers dressed up as water nymphs and so on as well. So it's a remarkable history, and again one that we've been able to painstakingly piece together these different phases as a result of careful and very considered analysis of the finds. So what I'd like to do now is to take you through each of these phases and just give you a sense of how we have come to this sequential phasing. Of course, it's rather interesting because if we are correct about our dating of the establishment of the theatre at Paphos, it is undoubtedly the earliest permanent theatre structure built on the island. And it's reflective of a couple of different things. One, of course, is the growing importance of Nea Paphos under the Ptolemies. The other, of course, is the changing nature of the Eastern Mediterranean in those decades after the conquests of Alexander the Great, where Cyprus, like so many other urban centres and commercial centres of the Eastern Mediterranean, are adapting and reflecting those changes of the cultural koinai. What greater way to demonstrate that you are belonging to the new world than to construct a theatre within the newly and rapidly expanding urban centre of Nea Paphos around the harbour. But of course, it is worthwhile bearing in mind that there is a strong theatrical tradition on Cyprus before the theatre of Paphos is constructed. Richard Green has outlined this in a number of articles over the last 2 decades, but it's perhaps best typified by something such as this wonderful terracotta figurine now in the Cyprus Museum, which is of a much earlier date. And again, we know that it was the kings of Cyprus who financed the dramatic performance that Alexander the Great put on for his troops following the sack and the seizing of Tyre. So there was an awareness of Greek theatrical tradition on the island for a long time before the permanent structure, or the first permanent structure was built. The other important thing about the very early phasing of the theatre at Paphos is also the way that it reflects contemporary early Hellenistic trends in architectural design. One of the things that becomes very apparent from any wandering over the topography of Fabrica is that it's not a large enough slope to build a complete cavea, a complete area of seating into the hill. There is natural bedrock within the central section and around the lower levels, but on both the eastern side and the western side, there is no natural bedrock. And this is perhaps reflective of architectural trends taking place in Alexandria and elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, unlike traditional earlier Greek theatres on mainland Greece and within Magna Graecia. And so what you're getting is massive retaining walls that are being constructed around the exterior of the seating area, large amounts of a very, very compacted reddish soil. You'll see it just in the photographs being brought in, with embankments to hold everything in place, to stop the soil from moving, and for rows of seats cut from the local limestone to be added over the top of that imported soil to match up with the alignments of the cuts of the bedrock, the entire thing being covered with a layer of plaster, which creates the appearance of a universal seating pattern, and also, again, creates the effect of marbling at a fraction of the cost. As I said, we have very little evidence of this very early phase, but one thing that's worthwhile bearing in mind is that it is quite possible that the actual alignment of the theatre was ever so slightly different, and indeed it may not have even had its true classical semicircular form in this very early phase. Without doubt, any stage building, if it did exist, would have been wood and would have been merely of a single story. When we first started working on the project, and indeed following earlier test excavations in the area in the 1980s by a team from the University of Trier, and of course much earlier, Kyriakos Nikolaou opening a trench in the very upper part of the cavea in the 1960s. But everybody assumed that this was the centre line of the theatre because it runs on a true north-south alignment. Whereas quite clearly, this is actually the true centre of the theatre. The theatre is facing towards the harbour of Paphos, and it is facing on a south by southwest direction. It's another very clear indicator of an early construction date for the theatre because it is out of alignment with all of the other infrastructure on this part of Paphos. The theatre, I would suggest, predates the urban town plan that we will see later on. In the early phases of the history of Nea Paphos, this is not a problem. But by the time of the Antonine expansion, we begin to see major issues where the theatre, for the first time, is actually hemmed in by other construction and by other structures as well. The other key evidence of this very early phase is some very interesting lettering carved into the upper cavea, which the epigraphy is very clearly late 4th, early 3rd century BC as well. But in terms of what these letters represent in terms of its relationship to the theatre, to date remains unknown. One of the other indications of a very early theatre, and indeed a theatre of a much smaller scale than the structure as it now appears today, is a series of large bedrock cuts in what is now the Western Paradoi, and not quite as visible, but also picked up a series of bedrock cuts in the Eastern Paradoi as well. And as you'll see, they're incredibly deep. We've yet to fully excavate all of them. It's not a particularly safe place to excavate. They've been backfilled at various points in the history of the theatre, so there's no clear chronological indication. But our current interpretation is that these represent quarries as part of Fabrica that predate the theatre, or indeed might have actually provided the stone for the early phases of the theatre, before the realisation was that as the theatre expands, they are going to be in exactly the wrong spots, and so therefore have to be backfilled and covered over. It's also in this early phase that you get a sense of how an audience must have responded to performance and the actual physical remains of the theatre. Unfortunately, much of the seating was quarried away in late antiquity. And I'm not going to talk too much about the quarrying phase tonight, but it is one area of investigation that we are intending to do quite a fair bit of work on this particular season. But what you, in effect, are getting in many parts of the seating is something like a photographic negative, that you're getting where the stonemasons have literally cut the blocks out to be taken away and reused elsewhere, with traces of the plaster on the overlapping sections. But there are still a number of parts of the seats where you get an indication of how they must have looked originally, with this bull-horned shaped curvature on the front, enabling an audience member to kick your feet back a little bit so that you're not kicking the person in front of you. Unless that person's a large 6'4" Australian like myself and taking up all the seat. So just a section through parts of the upper and lower cavea to give you an idea of the slope and an idea of the scale of the seatings, which is not necessarily apparent if you visualise it today. We know much more about subsequent phases of the theatre, and this includes the Alexandrian makeover of the middle 2nd century BC. We're very fortunate that there was actually a statue base found and published in a number of places in the early 20th century. Unfortunately, the actual statue base itself has now been lost. But the early publications give us a clear indication that we are looking at a dedication from the Dionysic Guild of Artists of Paphos. Indeed, the inscription refers to an actor by name and refers to a Paphian playwright by name. So it is suggestive that there is a strong tradition of theatrical performance locally by this point in time. That statue base is undoubtedly reflective of architectural changes that are taking place within the theatre itself, and these are quite apparent from a number of fragmentary architectural remains. These are very distinctive in terms of the Alexandrian influence, and of course you will see parallels in structures such as the tombs of the kings, which are of a contemporary date. So a wonderful fragment of triglyph and metope, which would have been from the first ever stone stage building on the site, still with traces of coloured paint. And when I left the site this morning, Diana Wood-Conroy had a whole series of fragments of Hellenistic red painted frescoes out that were being cleaned by our conservator. So we're picking up more and more traces of this Hellenistic phase. This is the first of 3 phases of painted decoration that we are aware of on the theatre. And that's a major contribution towards the study of theatre architecture in its own right, given that it's actually quite rare for any theatre in the Mediterranean to actually have traces of plastered paint. There are a number, but it's very, very rare. And again, a whole series of typical architectural elements that are reflective of what you would see in Alexandria, but all being cut from local Paphian limestone. And again, all reflective of the stage building of this second phase. But perhaps the most interesting feature of the middle 2nd century is the digging of a so-called Chironian tunnel, a suborchestral tunnel leading from the rear of the stage building across the centre line of the theatre and cutting about 2/3 of the way into the orchestra. Now, the Chironian tunnels are rather interesting in their own right, because Paphos takes the list of known theatres in the entire Mediterranean with one of these tunnels to 13. It is the only example that we know of in Cyprus. They are incredibly rare. The most famous one is, of course, that on the island of Delos. The only ancient source to refer to these tunnels was, of course, Pollux, who was writing an encyclopedia more than 2 centuries after they stopped being used. And it is Pollux which gives us the description that these were tunnels used to allow ghosts to rise. That within the performance of a tragedy in which a character dies and descends down to Hades, and then later on, as part of the narrative, for whatever reason, that person must come back to life, the assumption was that the actor would run down in their heavy costume and mask to the trapdoor, wait for their cue, and open an ancient special effects, a long time before Hollywood. What is interesting is, of course, if Pollux is correct in terms of this description, why do we not see them more frequently? Why do we not have more examples than 13 of them? So Richard Green and myself have actually written a paper in which we question that very interpretation. But having said that, we have no viable alternative suggestion as to how it might have been used instead. So the tunnels themselves remain a mystery, but it is the only one on Cyprus. Ignore the medieval well, which is cut right through the very middle of it. It is also the only perpendicular one of the 13. Whatever it was used for, it was used up until it was filled in the very first decades of the 1st century AD. It was filled to the brim with very early Roman amphora and amphora sherds. Okay, so let's give you a sense of the scale of it. There's the exit. The Augustan phase, which is undoubtedly associated with the earthquake, of which Augustus oversaw the restoration of a number of public buildings within Paphos, and indeed led to Paphos gaining the first of its honorific titles as well, is perhaps best typified at the theatre, not so much through any stage building adaptation, although there are some architectural elements which hint at an Augustan remodelling of the theatre stage building itself. But it is primarily on the western side of the theatre where it becomes quite clear that the analemma wall has collapsed and is rebuilt and reinforced with an additional layer. So we actually have the world's only semicircular theatre, which is actually 181.5 degrees because of this extra reinforcement on that side as well. And this is along here. But it is the Antonine phase of which we have the greatest amount of evidence, and indeed the greatest amount of evidence of the theatre's relationship to what is happening elsewhere within the quarter. What you'll see is a visual from the virtual reality 3D model that we created, and a few other images as well, including one of our young team members actually using it. And I'll just to say at the very end of the presentation, if anyone's interested in actually experiencing this concept of a virtual reality restoration of an ancient theatre, I would invite you to come and have a look at it. I don't want to talk too much about it, but I've found it to be an incredibly useful tool in terms of public engagement back in Australia. We did use it as part of our art exhibition for Paphos 2017 European Cultural Capital. And what is also quite remarkable is that it has enabled us to use this model to challenge anyone suggesting why should the theatre not be restored for modern performances as well. And I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later in this presentation. But what I would like to do, budget depending, at some point in time is to actually create multiple interpretations of various phases of the theatre history so that you actually get a sense of how it did change through time. But it comes with a caveat that we know the most about this particular phase, that everything else is going to be incredibly conjectural. We know a lot about this phase because the Romans actually left us a love letter, I guess. It's the largest dedication inscription ever found on Cyprus, carved from marble. It is an inscription which we believe would have been positioned between the first and second stories of the stage building. So that is within this section here. The smaller part was discovered in 1916. The larger part was discovered by our team in 2002. And what it records is the people of Paphos, with all of its honorific titles, described as the mother city of the cities of Cyprus. So again, emphasising its role as the Roman capital, thanking and naming both Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius, and thanking them for the gifts of the paradoi, which we read as a reference to the new fresco scheme and the barrel vaulting of the entranceways that takes place. Thanking them for the statue, which we read as the imperial sculptural program and the use of marble to facade the stage building for the first time in its history. And the inscription then says, and it breaks off at that point. So I currently have a bet with my students that if anyone finds the missing word, I will buy them a lot of alcohol. But nonetheless, it's an incredibly impressive piece. I believe it will take pride of place within the new Paphos Museum when it opens very soon. And it is reflective of just the scale of this phase of the theatre's history. We have evidence of the theatre seating and the theatre stage building being expanded to a hitherto unexpected level. On the very northwestern section of the seating, we have exposed part of one of the vomitoria. Okay, so here is the retaining wall that is constructed to hold all of that seating in place, and here is the bedrock cut exitway leading out. Okay, so through there, if you ignore all the later additions. And again, you just get a sense of the sheer size and scale. And if you wear the 3D model, you'll really be immersed in terms of just how vertigo-inducing it would have actually been up in the upper levels as well. But also just the sheer size and scale of the stage itself. One of the interesting things, again, if you strip away the more recent construction on the site, so the 1950s service trenches that were cut through, and the late antique pits in here, which might have been used for tanning or possibly for dyeing as well. But one of the things that you'll see is just the sheer size of the Antonine platform the amount of masonry required to actually support the new barrel-vaulted entranceways that were being constructed on either side for the first time. And as we began to excavate that, what we began to realise was that we were picking up evidence of infrastructure directly south of it as well. So as the years have progressed, we've actually uncovered a nymphaeum, more than 20 metres long and more than 5 metres wide. And I spoke a little bit about the nymphaeum and the road the last time I presented in this space, so I won't discuss it in too much detail now, but just to give a chronological framework for how we are now interpreting how the theatre quarter was developing and growing. We have a major road directly south of the nymphaeum. And the nymphaeum itself has a very, very simple floor mosaic, but it is built into a waterproof mortar, which is chamfered on the edges, by the way. It still retains its water. We had one season where it rained on the last days, and our final photos literally consist of the excavators almost in tears, standing in water up to their ankles. So it is interesting to see that it still retains the water. But what it would have featured is at least one niche, possibly others, which would have been adorned with marble sculpture, facing out onto the road. So there's some of the mosaic. It still retains plaster. And again, you'll see just the scale of it. Some very fragmentary pieces that at least give us an indication of how the decorative scheme might have looked. And interestingly, a water trough facing out onto the road as well. Now, it's very difficult at this point in time to determine the date of the nymphaeum, besides saying, and here is a hypothetical reconstruction of how it may have looked, but I want to present that with a whole lot of caveats that there is much work to be done in terms of the upper levels of that structure. But one of the interesting things is that the nymphaeum itself is aligned precisely on an east-west, north-south direction, whereas the theatre facing towards the southwest is on a different alignment, such as that. And this has not created a problem up until now, because you'll see that the Antonine expansion suddenly runs into this building. So the nymphaeum has to predate the Antonine expansion, and it seems most likely that it's going to be Trajanic at the earliest, but probably most likely Hadrianic in date. And it's facing out onto a road system that I will come back to in some detail. So it means that if we look at some of the entranceway leading into the eastern parados and the relationship of the rear of the Antonine stage building, we actually get to see some of the phasing. That here is the nymphaeum, we're facing south in this photograph. Here is the wall of the foundations of the stage building, that massive structure that you saw in the VR model. And here is an earlier phase of the entranceway, which is on a different alignment to the later phase that we see up here, which is typified by the fragments of the mosaic, which would have led all the way down to the road in its initial format before that's been broken up and damaged in later phases. So again, we're getting some understanding of the changes in direction and the phasing, but it's often only tantalising glimpses. So it's perhaps best typified here by the theatre on this alignment and everything else in this part of the town on this alignment. Just to emphasise the construction of this Antonine support for the Eastern Parados, in 2017 we actually cleared out this wedge section behind, found a series of bedrock cut drains, which again are reflective of water supply and water usage, and our conservator, as we speak, is in the process of putting together this lovely pinch-handled amphora, which seems to date very... It'd be nice to have a coin, but we work with what you have, and it seems to very nicely suggest that it's being filled in at the same time that the theatre is being expanded as well. Now, moving back to the theatre, or sorry, actually, before we do that, moving back onwards, what you get now is a sense of how the theatre is impacting upon the infrastructure around it. The Nymphaeum, the theatre, and now the road that I want to talk about. And again, I spoke about this in some length in the last presentation I gave. We have a series of papers coming out about this road in the next few months. But it's 8.41 metres wide between the facing onto the Nymphaeum building and the wall that we pick up. You can't actually see it in this particular photograph, but the wall that we've picked up on the southern side of that road. So we are suggesting that it is actually the Decumanus Maximus. We are suggesting that it was actually colonnaded. And we are suggesting that it leads up to the ancient city gate leading from Paphos on the Pilgrim's Trail up to Palea Paphos. And it's interesting, of course, that the excavations that the department under Staffy Raptu have been conducting in that area recently, we have a lot of work to do in terms of marrying up alignments and so on. But I think that the infrastructure of the city wall and various other things are very nicely suggesting that you have a whole lot of key features in this part of the town. The Nymphaeum itself, located so close to the city gate, was reflective of this idea of a Roman display of not just conquering peoples, but also conquering nature. That as you walk through the city gate, you are into an area where water is being supplied, it is cooling, it provides water to splash on your face or to drink as well. You have entered into urban Roman controlled space. So the road network itself is an area of considerable interest for our project. We have a drainage system running underneath it, which we've done a number of soil analysis of. It's proved to be very rich in finds, such as this wonderful little bronze figurine of Athena. And we've picked it up elsewhere on the site. Again, ignore the modern infrastructure over top of it. We've got consistent alignment of the road for at least 90 metres along. And what this now enables us to suggest is that we can think about the urban layout of Roman Paphos and begin to make some extrapolations back about Hellenistic Paphos as well. So this whole question of the layout of the land is one which has been discussed for at least 4 decades now, and most famously in the urban grid alignment drawn up in the late 70s, early 80s. The concept being that most of Paphos was on a true Hippodamian grid plan and was outlined on a true north, south, east, west alignment. The major difference being the area of the wealthy houses, which, if you follow Vitruvius's arguments in terms of town planning, that coastal towns should be built in such a way to take advantage of coastal breezes as well. So it's actually textbook in many ways. But what we're now suggesting is that line R is actually representative of the fact that we have an entire additional block along here just to the west of the eastern city walls of Nea Paphos, and that our road represents the major east-west aligned road of the town, and the major Cardo Maximus is not this one as everyone thought, but rather this one over here. So what we've done with this plan is to literally lay that plan over a Google Earth image of the town. And so what we are suggesting is that we have road here, road here, road here, and again a series of blocks all the way down, and that we've got the major east-west route across here, and the major north-south route is actually this one down here. And the reason that we're suggesting that is because of these granite columns. Now, anyone who spent any time walking around Paphos will know the Troad granite columns. They are everywhere. Some of them, of course, were reused in later architectural features, but here is actually one intact column from the theatre site, which has been broken down into smaller sections at some point in late antiquity. And again, all over the town. So in 2015, we actually geomapped every column that we could find from the surface, and the mapping of this effectively suggested that the key points were along our road, along Saranda Colonnes, where of course they've been reused for the Crusaders, where they've been rolled from elsewhere, and obviously around the Basilica area on the eastern part of the town. But the major pattern of where they are being found is on that road and on that road along there. So it doesn't mean that there may not have been other major roads within Paphos. Undoubtedly they were, but it seems to be that these were the colonnaded roads, and that the intersection of the two colonnaded roads was right at the very western corner of the theatre. It becomes the centre of major traffic movement in the 2nd century AD, and the Troad column and colonnades should date to the Severan period. They should date to the very end of the 2nd century AD. So confident were we on this that a number of years ago we actually did a GPR research project to see if we could pick up other traces of the road due south, but all of the evidence was very, very mixed. So this season we're actually opening a trench 33 metres south, and we hope to pick up evidence of the next road due south, which will confirm the alignment and will confirm the distribution of the roads. So returning back to the theatre, one of the other interesting things about the Antonine phase is the sheer scale of marble and the use of marble. So we have imported marble from more than 20 different locations, and you'll see everything from spirally fluted marble, spirally fluted columns cut from Proconnesian marble, a whole range of Corinthian capitals that are on various parts of the stage building, and a whole series of facading of the stage building in marble from a whole range of areas. And it gives you a sense of the sheer size and scale of the Roman export of architectural blocks in that high imperial period of the middle to late 2nd century AD. And also a number of tantalising glimpses of what the imperial sculptural program must have looked like on the stage building itself. So fragments of sandaled feet. The lion's head is actually representative of a greave that one of the emperors would have been standing wearing. Again, some of them quite spectacular finds as they've come out of the ground, albeit fragmentary. So Richard Green is in the process of actually reconstructing to the best of our ability what the sculptural program would have looked like in terms of individual members of the imperial family. But we do have some really interesting pieces, including these two relief carved figures from 2 bits of marble. Unfortunately, both of them were found in disturbed context, but what they seem to be to us is probably decorative elements on statue bases. But it's worthwhile bearing in mind that the griffin was a relatively common motif within Antonine art. You'll see it on cuirasses such as this one in the Louvre, and this detail of a figure which is now in the Israel Museum. The reference to the paradoi in the Antonine inscription is perhaps best reflective of the new decorative elements giving way for performers to enter into the phase, enter into the orchestra and enter onto the stage building during this phase. It's worthwhile bearing in mind too that despite the remarkable use of marble from a whole range of sources, you do have marble facading, or rather faux marble architectural elements such as the floor surface here, which is imitating. So they are cutting costs in certain areas, but also using very high-end marble imports on others. But you'll see along the surviving western wall some traces of the painted fresco scheme. We have some incredibly well preserved examples of a schema which features garlanded colonnades and capitals that effectively performers are entering down a colonnade into the area in which they're going to be performing. So again, truly quite remarkable in terms of the preservation, the vibrancy of this Antonine art. Now, for a long time we thought that this Antonine theatre lasted for a very, very long time, but increasingly we are questioning And what is most likely is that I've got a virtual reality model of a phase of the theatre that probably only lasted 40 to 60 years. Because there seems to be a conversion of the theatre to an arena under the Severan period. The first indication of this was a series of postholes that we found around the area of the orchestra, which seemed to be reflective of some degree of fencing to separate the audience from what was taking place within the former orchestra. So forget this containment wall, or here it is, the upside down, which is a later addition. These are actually the features which are reflective of the first time the audience being separated from what is taking place within the venue. And you'll remember I said that in 2002 we found one of the two fragments of the Antonine inscription. We actually found it laying face down as a threshold on the Western Parados where you would have entered onto the orchestra and stepped over it. And it was only because our site geologist did what we tell every student not to do, which is to dig holes and put your hand in them, that we got a sense that there was actually an inscription underneath it. He actually raised it using bits of wood, which I think the Department of Antiquities sent a crane and a whole lot of very burly workmen, and they were not at all impressed to see a 74-year-old man lift the block with a few bits of wood. But what was interesting, of course, is that we've got one of the major features of that decorative scheme of the Antonine phase being reused on the theatre at presumably a relatively early date. Underneath it, we found a coin, which, although is not particularly clear following conservation, it is actually a coin of Caracalla. And here is a better example that found in the same season elsewhere on site, with the very typical Cyprian koinai depiction of the Temple of Aphrodite at Nea Paphos. I am suggesting that the arena was part of an entire Severan makeover of Paphos. And I don't have time to go into details as to why I think this, but it is worthwhile bearing in mind that there was a statue base discovered in Paphos in 1916 and one found in Paphos in 1888. Both of them were statues of Caracalla. Effectively, I think that you have the emperor farewelling pilgrims from Nea Paphos and the emperor welcoming the pilgrims when they actually make it to Paphos, and an entire infrastructure of the town, including the colonnades built around that movement of pilgrims as well. The creation of the arena is something referred to in contemporary texts, in particular Cassius Dio, who refers to the fact that wherever Caracalla travelled in the empire, the expectation was that the local people would adapt theatres into hunting arenas for his edification. And whilst there's no evidence that he came to Cyprus, the sheer fact that when he was in Syria that rumours might have travelled was used by Stilwell during the excavation of the theatre at Kurion to suggest that that was the date of Kurion's phase of an arena as well. I would argue that if Kurion is being adapted at this point in time, then it actually makes far more sense for Paphos because of its connection with imperial cult and because of the connection with Aphrodite to undergo some degree of conversion. So that Antonine inscription is perhaps the best clue we have of the theatre being turned for the first time as a space for performance into a space for spectacle. And again, a lot of the lower levels of the seats are perhaps being reshaped and remodelled for a platform rather than the seating that we saw earlier. What is undeniable is that after the Severans, the theatre was definitely being used as an arena because of the construction of this waterproofed containment wall. Again, separating the orchestra from the audience. The entire orchestra is now more than 40 centimetres higher than its Hellenistic phase. It is covered with a waterproof mortar, and indeed the recycled elements of the containment wall are also covered with a waterproof mortar. I should also just say in passing too that that lovely Antonine fresco scheme that I showed you before seems to have been completely covered over with an overpaint with this boring red colour. And this is probably Severan in date as well. But the final phase, as I say, is reflected by this wall, which is indicative of the very final phase of the theatre. How often it was used, we don't know. Within that former suborchestra tunnel that I talked about, they've laid pipes which suggest drainage out after it's been filled with water. And indeed, the very question of water supply to the theatre, but more significantly, water supply to Nea Paphos, is one that not just our project, but a number of other researchers working in Paphos are engaged with. I'm sure that many of you are aware that the team from the University of Avignon have found evidence of the aqueduct on the top of Fabrica, and I am suggesting that this cistern structure that they found, that one of our team did some calculations in terms of the volume that it could have contained, and interestingly, the literage is almost identical to the estimates for the amount of water that you would need to fill the former orchestra. Obviously, you need water, not just to supply to the theatre, but also the Nymphaeum and the other water features around the town. And again, I think that we're only now beginning to really attempt to understand that relationship of how important water was to Roman urban Paphos. This, of course, is one of the most beloved objects in the Cyprus Museum, and would have had water flowing out of it, and I think would have been accessed from one of the major streets. The one that we found in 2017 is nowhere near as impressive. This will not end up on display in the Cyprus Museum, but the Eros is actually holding a handle of an amphora, and that amphora's neck is hollow. And I would suggest that it's a similar scheme in terms of water passing through the sculpture. The whole thing is destroyed by earthquake at the end of the 4th century AD. And I won't talk in any detail, but I'm now going horribly over time, so I apologise. Very, very quickly, to place what we now know about the development of the Paphos theatre architecturally with the other 4 theatres of Cyprus. Jeff Stennett, our architect, put together this to give you a sense of scale and how the theatre of Paphos relates to the others on the island, and the Theatre of Dionysus for scale. And as I mentioned, anyone who's been to Australia, the Sydney Opera House for scale as well too. But what's interesting is that if you actually take a look at some of the other structures on the island, such as the theatre at Soli, excavated by the Swedish Cyprus expedition in the 1920s and restored it was the late 1960s, wasn't it? Yeah. It is seemingly a single-phase use theatre, which is dated to the 2nd century AD. We have, of course, Salamis Theatre. Vassos is responsible for excavating and our knowledge of. And again, the size and the scale, and I hope this is a bit of a trip down memory lane, some of these photographs for you. But, of course, what is significant is just how much larger the theatre at Salamis is compared to the one at Paphos. Whether that's reflective of population differences or perhaps the later dating would be an interesting question. The theatre at Kourion, which is middle 2nd century BC, and in many ways follows some of the trends that we see in Paphos from the reports of the excavation published by the University of Pennsylvania team in the 1950s. And again, you'll see just how heavily restored it actually is as well. Another key reason for us not to restore the site of Paphos, because Cyprus already has 3 restored theatres and a restored Odeon, so let's leave one of the sites as an archaeological site. The Paphos Odeon is most likely 2nd century AD in date as well. And of course, just while we're talking about venues for entertainment on the island, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that the amphitheatre at Salamis is most likely Flavian in date, based upon inscriptions, but that Paphos also has an amphitheatre which to date is unexcavated, but the chronology of that would be very interesting in terms of understanding the phasing of the arena of the Paphos theatre. If we go if we actually put forward the suggestion that this is contemporaneous with the amphitheatre in Salamis, the obvious question is, why would you convert the theatre to an arena if you've already got a venue. But it seems to me incredibly unlikely that the amphitheatre is any later than 3rd century as well. So it's an interesting question. Perhaps one day the amphitheatre will be excavated or studied in some detail. But wrapping it all up, let's actually have something of, let's actually compare those sites, because clearly the theatre of Paphos is the oldest on the island and is used for the longest in terms of multiple phases. The one at Soli, as I said, appears to be single phase only. Salamis is early Roman in its earliest phases, but again has multiple phases right up until the end of its lifespan as a venue for performance. And then Kurion, likewise, a little bit more recent than Nea Paphos, but perhaps the most similar in terms of chronological development. And then when one also thinks about the size and the scale, you also get a sense of just how impressive all 4 structures actually were, but also just how Paphos and Salamis were so much larger, which again is perhaps reflective of having the kudos of the status of both cities, and also reflective of much larger populations as well. What I'm suggesting is that now is perhaps a really good time to reinterpret the architectural development of those other 3 theatres as we begin to make more and more sense of Paphos. And it's an interesting question in terms of how these structures were central to the Hellenistic and certainly Roman urban experience on the island of Cyprus. So, to finish things up, we have been very busy over the last 24 years, but really every time I walk around that site, I see the next 25 years of my life in front of me as well. We are certainly willing to do as much as we can, and while ever Cyprus is happy to have a team from Sydney, we would love to continue working on it. There's a long tradition in Australian presentations of finishing your talk with a sunset shot, sunset photograph, and many of my colleagues in Australia work on sites in the South Pacific or on Aboriginal sites, and so there's this big thing about the sunset shot. But I'm going to finish with a sunrise photograph, and at the risk of sounding a little bit corny, just to say that although we've been working there 24 years, in many ways it's just the beginning of what we know about this section of Paphos and the theatre and its relationship with the infrastructure as well. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very, very much, Greg. It's obvious that you have been very busy over the last 25 years or so, and you have demonstrated to us how much work and how much time you have dedicated, you and your team, to this work. So thank you very much for this. I can imagine that there might be some questions on the Paphos Theatre or in Cypriot theatres in general.
When the theatre was turning to the arena, so the Antonine stage had collapsed with the earthquake and was just removed, or?
Well, it's difficult to tell whether there was an earthquake. There's no obvious evidence of a late 2nd century earthquake, but you are right that the focus has definitely gone from the stage building back to the former orchestra. So the interesting question would be, is the stage building in ruins? And you've got to assume that they've at least stripped part of it. If you're taking the dedicatory inscription down and actually deliberately reusing it in such a way, to me it indicates that the stage building itself must be at least partially ruinous, but there's no clear obvious signs of an earthquake at that particular point in date. So it could well be that it's been deliberately ripped down as such. But with it,
And the whole building, so it must have been quite an effort.
it would have been a massive effort to take it down. Yes, yes, if it is deliberately by humans.
I'm puzzled why you called your second period Alexandria. You know, I've been admiring the work you've been carrying out. I think it's fantastic what you are doing with such a poorly preserved site. It's really incredible. So just a curiosity, I mean, you mentioned Alexandrian architecture and similarities, but what about the first stage? Wouldn't that be Alexandria?
You are absolutely right, it would be, but we have no remains at all. So it's a way of distinguishing earlier Hellenistic from later Hellenistic, but it's merely shorthand. You are right that the city itself during its entire Ptolemaic period is reflective of Alexandrian traditions. It's just that for the first time we have them in stone. And the assumption that we've always had was that that first stage building was wooden. But again, probably reflecting of what was happening in Egypt. Yeah. It's rather frustrating not to have at least one element from that very first phase, but yet, yeah, yes.
Questions or comments? I think everybody's curious to try your
Yes.
equipment there.
Come and have a play.
If I may, yeah, Maria.
Two questions. First one, do you have any fragments over here? Because I know not from Cyprus, but elsewhere, theaters, people would write, and that was a good way to see how the theater was integrated into
Yep.
this design.
No, we do have. We have a lot of masons' marks, but I mean, again, whether they're contemporary theatre construction or, in some cases, they're obviously later. I mean, I have not at all spoken about late antiquity and the medieval use of the former theatre as well. So, yeah. Yes. That's a separate lecture, and it's hard enough to fit what I had into an hour, let alone the entire history of the site. But yes, there's a lot of evidence.
Any chance of the virtual reconstruction of the medieval neighborhood?
Yeah, it's not impossible, but architecturally, so much of it would be conjectural. Yeah. What I can tell you is, over the past few seasons, we've been working on a big medieval building up here, and indeed we're working on it now. It's a monumental structure, and the sgraffito and the courseware ceramics are certainly. We've got at least 11th through to 15th century. I would imagine for something like this, that structure is probably going to give us a better indication of it's going to give us more to work with in terms of recreating something rather than over the former stage building and orchestra, which we've got some really interesting courtyards, some really interesting foundations of structures, and some have been published and some will be published, but very difficult in terms of recreating the opportunity of walking through it at this point in time. But not impossible, something we should consider. It's remarkably cheap, actually, this type of technology. It is, and in getting cheaper all the time too. So one of the things that is interesting is whether there are other projects in Cyprus that we can think about applying some of these digital techniques to, in terms of getting our visitors the experience of what it's like to sense what is now ruins, how it must have looked in antiquity. But I am personally very keen in terms of multiple phase interpretation, so we should talk at some stage.
Questions? What about the theatrical awareness that you mentioned before? Since you emphasize the need to open theaters in general, not just the Paphos theater. What other evidence do we have apart from the terracotta statues that there was theatrical awareness before the festival?
There's a very, very strong tradition of terracottas on the island. I'm not qualified to speak on it. You need Richard Green to actually talk about it, but a very close connection with Athenian costume traditions as well too, which is interesting. So, and again, on that early date, I think Marion's got to be the pathway in terms of connectivity as well. But there is undoubtedly an awareness on the island of performances, and I'm not quite sure if there are any literary.
In Socrates, Agora, Socrates tells us that Nicocles used offered theatrical performance
Yes, that's true actually. Yes, that is true. Yes.
There are lots of traditions.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
So since you are going to continue excavating and publishing things, I'm sure we'll have you back soon
Awesome.
for another lecture.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
You should see that because
There we go.
Your phone is actually on.
Yeah, so it's just loaded as an app onto the phone.